you. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, yeah, we got some more people coming in. All righty. Well, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Teresa Stows, the president of the League of Women Voters of Collier County. And we welcome all of you here. And I know that there are even more people who are planning to watch it once we get it posted to our website. So I want to thank Jessica Lowe-Minor, who's the president of the League of Women Voters of Florida, for being so willing to address us today, because this is a very, very important topic and it affects really all of us in all the areas of interest that we have. Jessica, as I said, is the president, but I have all these little notes here, but I'd rather just tell you she's the bomb. She's absolutely a rock star. She's terrific. I mean, she has put so much new light and energy into the state league and puts a little different perspective on things, and I really appreciated it. One of the things that she does is that she does a Monday kind of a leaders call, but it's communication. And here's what we're talking about. And so some of you have been in our board meetings. I have several board members on here, and I say this, don't say that, say this, don't say that. And that's just from leadership from the state league. And it's very, very important to us as we are trying to maneuver through uncharted waters. It's kind of worn out now, but it's still applicable. So, Jessica, thank you so much, and I'll let you get started.
Yay, thank you so much. Collier County, I'm really happy to be here. And yeah, we are unfortunately in interesting times as the Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. I do think we are living in interesting times, particularly here in Florida, and we are facing a number of unprecedented events. What happened? My dogs are chasing my cats, so give me one sec.
While she's doing that, I will tell you that we will be taking questions and in the chat, and I will be monitoring the chat. So don't hesitate to put your comments in there or questions, and we will be sure to help you out. Also, if you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your video and still listen. But otherwise, once we get to talking, you're just going to be little tiny blips. So it's not too much to worry about.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. I've restored peace in the home. The cats, the cats and the dogs are in separate rooms. And we'll talk about redistricting. I guess fighting like cats and dogs is a good theme for today's discussion, because that is certainly what we're seeing at the Capitol. And I want to leave plenty of time for conversation because I know many of you are already following this. So some of my remarks today are going to be just refreshers, and then we'll have a more candid conversation about what we can do as a league network. Okay. What is happening here? Okay. So we're just going to be doing a quick look today at kind of the redistricting landscape. We're going to look at Florida. We're going to talk about our positions as an organization and then the advocacy opportunities that exist. Okay. So an overall kind of refresher on how we get to the point where we're going through redistricting. The Constitution demands that there be a census done. It demands that that census is done at least every 10 years. There's nothing prohibiting it from being done more frequently. A mid-decennial census is allowed under the Constitution. However, it has never happened. And so as a country, We've done a census every 10 years. The census is a very expensive endeavor. I know many of you have worked as volunteers on the census, on helping to get people counted, on all of the kind of community outreach to get people aware of the census is coming up. There's a lot that goes into conducting the census and making sure that there is universal participation, or as close to universal participation as is possible. And there really isn't a way, certainly under, the current constraints, for it to take less time than it takes. Like a census is a big undertaking. There's 330 plus million people in the country, and literally reaching all of them is a massive deal. So, at one point, the president was talking about a new census. There would be a mid-decade census. That is just not a reality. So typically what happens is that you do the census every 10 years. Once the census is done, and you get the information back from the census, then the Congress is like, okay, based on how many people there are, divided by the number of congressional seats, that is how many people are going to be needing to be assigned to each congressional seat. And there is some variation, because let's say that, there should be 750,000 people in any congressional district. Well, it might be that a state has a population of less than 750,000 people, right? So that kind of throws it off a little bit. But for the most part, um, the number of seats that are assigned to each state is based on the total number of people in their state divided by whatever that magical kind of threshold is for a congressional district. And based on your state's population, you may be assigned an extra congressional seat, or you may lose a congressional seat. So if your state has lost population over the last 10 years relative to where the census was 10 years earlier, you might have seats taken away. Or if you've grown a lot, you might get seats, right? But you can't arbitrarily add a seat without taking a seat away from someone else. And so earlier this year, there was a conversation of, oh, Florida's population has grown since the census and we need to have more seats. Well, like, unless somebody else's seats get taken away, there are no extra seats in Congress for Florida to get. And so that was also this kind of red herring conversation that we heard. But regardless, you do the census, you find out how many seats your state is going to be eligible, how many congressional seats your state will be eligible for based on where all the people across the country now live. And then once you know how many seats you're going to have, the legislature is going to draw a map that meets our state constitutional standards on redistricting to assign your state those seats, and to draw where those seats will be. So in Florida, we currently have 28 seats, congressional seats, that have been assigned to us based on our population as it was counted in 2020. Okay, so the states draw the maps for U.S. House, State Senate, and State House. Again, it determines the distribution of resources, and the maps are often not fair. So different states have their own standards for how they do redistricting. Some states have almost no standards, so they might have to adhere to federal laws like the Voting Rights Act, has some standards for, or currently has some standards, we'll talk about that, for how redistricting will be done. But, not all states have specific standards the way Florida has. So Florida has state constitutional standards that were put in place by the voters, by us. So League of Women Voters worked on that to make sure that redistricting was done in an intentional and nonpartisan way. But that doesn't mean that our legislature follows the rules. So we'll talk about that. Okay, so this was the landscape that we just laid out. Some states right now are planning or have already moved into early redistricting. We believe that these different movements that are happening around early redistricting, so not following the normal calendar of, okay, you've got your census and then you have to do a reapportionment and then you do redistricting based on that. this mid-cycle redistricting, mid-decade redistricting, we as an organization believe represents calculated political moves to control the 2026 election outcomes. These are not things that we would typically be seeing in, a quote, normal process. Okay. So is it legal? 11 states in the US prohibit mid-decade redistricting. They say this is the year that redistricting happens. Anything outside of that is not allowed. In our state constitution, it says that the legislature at its regular session in the second year following each decennial census shall by joint resolution shall apportion the state. So like that says that it has to happen kind of 2 years after the census is done. So like if the census was done in 2022, the 2022 legislative session is when our state legislature shall apportion the state. Other than that, though, it doesn't say that our state can't do mid-decade redistricting. It says it has to do apportionment on that second year after the census, but it doesn't say that it couldn't do it another time. And so that's a little bit of a frustration that we don't have more clarity. Had we known that people were going to try to do mid-decade redistricting, maybe that would have been something that we would have contemplated in the Fair Districts amendments. But as of now, we believe that our state constitution places the kind of purview of whether or not to do mid-decade redistricting in the legislature's court. All right. So we'll talk real quickly. I don't want to get into super nitty-gritty here because I know you all will have time for questions. But we'll talk a little bit about some federal protections as it relates to redistricting. So the Voting Rights Act, under certain circumstances, guarantees non-white populations the opportunity to elect a candidate of their choice. That is what's currently known as Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, is the component that relates to redistricting. That component is currently being challenged by the state of Louisiana. There is a case called Louisiana v. Calais. It has been argued at the Supreme Court, but the U.S. Supreme Court has yet to issue a ruling. But essentially, the state of Louisiana is arguing that it should not have to comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, that it should be able to draw its districts essentially without regard for race, meaning that it could what's often called like crack minority districts. And so you talk about redistricting sometimes with this parlance of cracking and packing. So packing means that you take any voter of a certain demographic, a certain party, right? Voters who you kind of want to like minimize their impact on the electorate. You like squeeze them all into one district so that you can make that one district will represent those voters, and then everything else around it is like essentially free of those voters. So you can like, have all these surrounding districts for your party, right? So that's called packing. Cracking is if you had, let's say you had like a, majority African American community, right? And they were all living mostly like this. And, you could potentially have a district that all of these voters get a chance to choose, an elector of their choice, right? They can choose a vote to vote for a certain congressperson or a certain, state house member or state senator. Well, so if you came in and you said, hey, well, there's this, black community here, but we could come in and we could kind of slice this like a pie, right? So now this black community here is now broken up into all of these surrounding districts. So just a little sliver of the community here is part of this district, and then a sliver of the community here is part of this district, right? Well, so now you've taken a district where you could have reasonably had Black representation, or at least the Black electorate there would have had a chance to elect someone that they chose. Now you've made it impossible because you've cracked that district. You've broken it into pieces, right? So the Federal Voting Rights Act has standards for when it kind of rises to the level of being a situation where a district would be federally protected. If there's a certain percentage of the electorate there that's non-white, if there's a history of that non-white population voting differently than the white population, right? There's kind of different criteria that have to be met in order to generate Federal Voting Rights Act Section 2 protections, right, for districts. So Louisiana is saying, even though 33% of our state population is Black, we in Louisiana, the state government of Louisiana, don't believe that we should have to draw our 6 congressional seats, leaving 2 that are minority access districts, and having 4 for kind of the general population, i.e. the white population in Louisiana. We believe that we should be able to draw our districts in such a way where there is maybe only 1 or maybe 0 minority access districts. And they've made that case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has yet to issue a ruling. So one of the things that has been raised in Florida is that that ruling is expected to potentially undermine the Voting Rights Act. We don't know if it will, but people are suspecting that it might. And so that case has been used as rationale for why we would need to redistrict in Florida, because, oh, well, if Louisiana gets to redraw its maps to eliminate minority access seats, then we should also get to do that. It has been like the state's kind of argument. So we'll see. I mean, and again, the SCOTUS case on Louisiana v. Calais has not even come out. It could potentially not come out until June 30th. That would be the last day that the opinion could drop. So we shall see what happens there. If the Supreme Court does choose to overturn Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, in whole or in part, I do think that that will be used by the state of Florida as somehow rationale for mid-cycle redistricting, even though the Supreme Court's decision would only directly impact Louisiana. It will be used as like a precedent, essentially. Okay, so then our U.S. Constitution obviously has the Equal Protection Clause. I'm going to move this so you all can see this side of the slide. And the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment prohibits race from predominating during the redistricting process. So, we do have, equal protection under the law, regardless of race. And so there is also this kind of balance in redistricting that like racial concerns can't be the only reason that you draw a map. And that's why the Voting Rights Act, you have to have specific criteria in place before racial considerations about districts can be applied, right? Okay, so then where are we at in Florida? I'm going to move this back again. Sorry, y'all, that we're having to do that. So in Florida, in 2010, there was a constitutional amendment that many of you voted for, you helped gather petitions, you worked on, but actually 2 constitutional amendments, Amendments 5 and 6, that created state criteria for redistricting. And so again, like the federal criteria is the U.S. Constitution, the 14th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act, Section 2, right? But this put into place specific criteria in addition to those 2 things that every state has to meet. For now, at least, the Voting Rights Act hasn't yet been overturned. Um, we in Florida said that districts could not be drawn with a partisan intent. And so there are a lot of states that are currently doing partisan gerrymandering, and they are saying the reason we are doing this map is because we want to benefit this specific party. We want this party to have an advantage, right? And the court is like, well, okay, like it's not illegal in your state to redistrict for partisan reasons, so I guess we'll allow it, right? So like Texas, its map is most likely going into effect. California, its map is going into effect, right? Like a number of states recently have said we are gerrymandering specifically for partisan reasons. And the federal courts have said, okay. In Florida, we have language in our state constitution that says you cannot draw maps with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. And so if our state is moving forward with maps in this very partisan context where it's very obvious that the only reason they're doing this is for partisan gain, we do have a way to challenge it in our state courts. And we hope that, frankly, it doesn't come to that. But if it does advance to the courts, we hope that we will ultimately be able to stop this there. Okay, we've talked about the history of gerrymandering. We've talked about Amendments 5 and 6. LWV was very engaged in the petition gathering process for Amendments 5 and 6. And we were also the one of the plaintiffs in the case, the very first case where we challenged the legislature's maps based on the criteria that was put into our state constitution in 2010, right? So we were like, hey, we helped get this into the state constitution when the legislature tried to put maps into place that didn't adhere to those standards that we helped put into the constitution. We were among the groups that sued the state to say, hey, this isn't copacetic. And actually, we were very successful in that litigation in the mid 2010s. Okay, so we'll move on from this. Okay, so this is the exact criteria that's in the Constitution in Florida. So district lines must not be drawn to favor one political party over another. So that's the non gerrymandering, nonpartisan requirement. That district lines must not be drawn to harm voting power of racial or language minorities. So that's essentially our kind of state way of implementing the Voting Rights Act. And that district lines must be contiguous and then also ideally compact and follow existing boundaries where possible. So that's what is currently in our state constitution. Florida's legislature didn't follow the Fair Districts amendments. They ignored the will of the people. And we had to, again, engage in litigation. So this is a sense of what happened in 2012 through 2015. So you can see an example of a gerrymandered map that was passed in 2012. And then you can see on the bottom the map that the league ultimately ended up proposing to the courts and that the courts adopted through litigation. And you can tell the difference. So the top map, that like kind of snaky district, that is an example of packing. And so the legislature was trying to take all of the minority voters from North Florida to Orlando and like squeeze them into one district so they would only have one representative in Congress, leaving all these other districts around, to be more likely to be non-minority, to have non-minority voters. That was not consistent in our view with the Fair District standards. And so you can see the map on the bottom, which represented, a way to protect minority access as well as have a more, kind of balanced approach in terms of the compactness, the contiguousness of the districts, et cetera. Okay. So we got through the 2022 cycle. I'm sorry, the 2012 cycle. The league sued. Our suit was successful, and you saw the map on the bottom is an example of what the map looked like after that suit, right? So then we get to 2022. The legislature actually drafted a reasonable congressional map. So their map that they drafted in 2022 looked very similar to the one from 2025. They made some changes. There was an additional congressional seat. I believe we went from 27 to 28 congressional seats during that period. And so there were some changes, but it was a pretty decent map overall. Um, the map that the legislature originally enacted, though, was, or I guess proposed. So the legislature proposed it. Governor DeSantis came in and said no. And he put forward his own map. His own map eliminated, in particular, among other things, his map eliminated a district that had been a Black minority access district in North Florida that had been represented by a Black congressman. And we filed suit saying, hey, this undermines the section of our state constitutional standards that say district lines must not be drawn to harm the voting power of racial or language minorities. So to go from a map that has, you know, X number of minority access districts to now a map that has fewer, right? Like that's harm to the voting power of racial or language minorities. Um, Unfortunately, in July of 2025, the Florida Supreme Court upheld the governor's map. And so we had been fighting over that from 2022 to 2025. But in July of 2025, the Florida Supreme Court said, well, because of the equal protection clause in the US Constitution, we don't believe that the governor's map is unconstitutional. And so that really, to be frank, like undermined the racial protection, like the minority access protection that the Fair District standards had originally contained. However, nobody had sued. We had sued over basically going from, I don't know exactly how many minority access districts to fewer. That had been the reason for the lawsuit. But we had not sued over whether or not the map represented a partisan gerrymander. So the section of the Fair District Standard saying maps cannot be drawn with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or incumbent, that was not at issue in 2025. That wasn't, our argument as the League of Women Voters. And so the court has not struck down that provision. Like, so sometimes people say, oh, well, the court struck down fair districts in 2025. They struck down the minority access component of the fair district standards, but they did not evaluate or make a decision on the nonpartisan standards, the non-gerrymandering standards, saying that you cannot draw districts with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or incumbent. So if you're hearing from people who talk about, oh, well, fair districts was struck down, that is not accurate. All right, so this does give you a sense of the difference. So this seat, District 5, is the seat that was the minority access district in North Florida that went from Jacksonville and kind of across what's sometimes known as the Black Belt of North Florida and captures, a lot of Black voters all the way to Gadsden County, which is, I believe, still the only majority minority county in Florida. And so this original seat in 2025 had enabled that population to have the ability to elect a congressional candidate of their choice. You can see in 2022, the governor's map does not enable that. So, and there is not currently a Black congressman representing or congresswoman representing North Florida. So that is a loss for particularly Black voters in that area. Okay, so then where are we now? So after the Supreme Court upheld the governor's map in 2025, in July of 2025, we all thought that was kind of going to be it. That now this is the map that's going to be in place, and you know, we'll see again in 2032 after a new census. Um, Unfortunately, right after that, Governor DeSantis called for Florida to be given an additional seat in Congress, which again we talked about isn't really possible, and for mid-decade redistricting. In September, the Speaker of the House, the State House here, Daniel Perez, appointed a select committee to consider drawing new congressional districts. And then in November, um, the first meeting of the select committee was scheduled. So there have been two meetings of this group, this kind of committee of members of the Florida House. They met in early December on December 4th and then again on December 10th. At neither of those meetings, and those are the only two meetings that have happened to date, at neither of those meetings were members of the public able to speak. And so we, as the League of Women Voters, really showed up. There were a lot of members who came up from all over the state. Some of you on this call came up, and nobody was able to speak to the committee in like during the committee. People may have been able to, talk to someone in their office or try to, chat with someone in the hallway, but there was no formal opportunity for public input. These are the folks who've been appointed to the committee. So there are 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats on the committee. And you can see who all has been assigned to that committee. Okay, so our position as a league, and I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to try to wrap this up pretty quickly. But we advocate in terms of redistricting for transparency and public input. So if they are going to do redistricting, it has to be through a process that everybody believes is transparent. The members of the public have an opportunity to be heard. There's a rejection of political motives, so people feel confident that the maps are drawn fairly, not to benefit a specific party, but that because, that's the most fair way to draw the map. That minority representation is taken into consideration, that there's community integrity, and ideally, we would recommend that independent commissions draw the lines. And so that's something that we may need to talk to voters about in the future. It's about the idea of amending the Constitution in order to enable the creation of an independent redistricting commission. This is a quote that I've been giving to the media. So Florida families expect their elected leaders to focus on the kitchen table issues affecting voters' daily lives, not diverting millions in taxpayer dollars to a rushed and unnecessary redistricting process. Plus, it's illegal in Florida to draw districts with a partisan intent. And so anytime that we can remind people that even contemplating redistricting in this like partisan framework where all of these states are saying openly that they're redistricting explicitly for partisan reasons, right? That is the context in which this proposed redistricting would be happening. Even doing redistricting in Florida is partisan at this moment. So they need to stop. They should not do it. It is illegal under our state constitution to draw districts with the intent to favor or disfavor political parties' incumbents. And it's expensive. So redistricting costs a lot of money. They are spending money on GIS. They are spending money on analysts, on consultants, a whole host of things. Not to mention, if it goes to litigation, which it almost certainly would end up in litigation, there will be millions of taxpayer dollars spent on attorney fees to defend unconstitutional maps. So this is a major waste of taxpayer money. And it also takes legislators' attention away from the issues that Floridians actually want legislators to be looking at, including the cost of daily life here in Florida and rising insurance costs, all kinds of things that Floridians are very frustrated with. All right. So our position is that the US has never had a mid-decade census. We talked about that. Without new census data, there's no justification for redistricting. This sets a dangerous precedent. And in a democracy, voters choose the politicians. Politicians should not choose voters. So this act of like slicing and dicing the electorate to give your party some modicum of political advantage, that act in and of itself is an anti-democratic, small d democratic, right? Action. We talked about Floridians looking for their leaders to focus on affordability, and mid-cycle redistricting ignores Floridians' real needs. So, what do Floridians say? A survey that was done in September of 2025 by Common Cause, 55% of Floridians reject mid-decade redistricting altogether. I thought this was very interesting. 76% support independent commissions made up of citizens, not lawmakers, to draw district lines. 66% support Congress banning maps that favor one political party over another. And 66% support Congress banning mid-decade redistricting altogether. So it is pretty clear that Floridians' opinions on redistricting and their, I would say, lack of trust in politicians to do the job fairly has not changed that much since Floridians approved Amendments 5 and 6 to go into the state constitution in 2010, right? At that time, 63% of Floridians approved that. Now, 66% support Congress banning maps that favor a political party over another and would also support Congress banning mid-decade redistricting. So it's, that is very, very clear. 2/3 of voters in the state, including Republicans, Independents, Democrats. This is not a partisan issue. So advocacy opportunities, we're asking every league member to write letters and call your state representative and state senator. So it's a both and. So call them, call their office, let them know that you're following this issue, that you live in their district, and that you do not want them to do mid-decade redistricting. You want them to vote no on mid-decade redistricting. You want them to reject mid-decade redistricting, any of those phrases, but just vote no. And then also write to them as well. So you can email or send them snail mail. But legislators' aides track every communication that they get on these topics, and they literally will like keep a little tally mark for any time they hear from a voter about an issue. And we want them to have 1,000 tallies in the no category for every, one tally in the positive. Schedule a meeting with your legislators if you're able to meet with them in person, and we'll go over the dates in just a second. Share information with your friends and networks. So encourage your friends to call, encourage them to write. Nopartisanmaps.org is like a little mini webpage that has links for this is how you can call your legislator. This is how you can find their address. This is what you should say. Here are talking points, right? So it's a very kind of concise, mobilization webpage, and you can share it. You can share nopartisanmaps.org as a resource. That resource was put together by a whole coalition of voting rights organizations, including us. So feel free to share it and just stay engaged. I mean, we're going to be, this is one of the league's number one priorities. We will be sending out information about this. There will, of course, be news articles. So just kind of being aware and knowing the facts so that you can talk to the people in your circles. Some overall points to make. Floridians do not support this. The Florida Constitution says that partisan gerrymandering is illegal. Mid-decade redistricting sows chaos and distrust. Taxpayers will be on the hook for the expenses. And then be aware of the changing landscape. So these are kind of just things for you all to know. Plans may change quickly. We're still waiting for this U.S. Supreme Court decision, the Louisiana v. Calais decision. And so make sure that you're kind of following the news and watching for statements from us. Like when that case comes down, regardless of what the opinion is, U.S. LWVUS will be issuing a statement. We'll probably also issue something about how it would impact us. But the Florida League and LWVUS are very keyed into anything that's happening right now with regard to this because this is so critical. All right, so dates to watch. I didn't get into this earlier, but this is important. So we're currently in legislative session. Session started on January 13th. The last day of session is March 13th. So we still have, and of course, session ends on Friday the 13th, which feels somewhat ominous, but hopefully not. But there will be a special session. The governor has called a special session on redistricting for April 20th to the 24th. And there are 38 days between the last day of session and the convening of the special session on redistricting on April 20th. And so the league is planning to do a 38-day campaign, like a mini campaign on redistricting to educate Floridians about what's going on, to urge people to contact their legislators to say no. Legislators will be back from session, so that's a great time to try to meet with them in their offices. You know, take action during this 38 days. So please do it now, but also know that during this 38-day window, we're really going to be trying to do everything we can to call Floridians' attention to what's happening so that by April 20th, legislators have just been bombarded by Floridians who are upset with this plan. The state candidates filing window is June 8th through the 12th. So basically, the idea is that all of the districts have to be finalized by then so that candidates know what district they live in and which district they're running for. Um, just so you all know, it had previously been before Governor DeSantis's kind of plan to redistrict the state. There had been the federal filing deadline for federal candidates for Congress had been April 20th to the 24th. And so we all were originally thinking, okay, these maps have to be finalized by April 20th because that's when the federal candidates need to file to run for Congress. So when Governor DeSantis called the special session for April, he authorized the Secretary of State to move the federal candidate filing deadline. Um, there are folks who believe that Governor DeSantis did not have the authority to declare 2026 a redistricting year and to move the federal filing deadline. Those folks are suing the DeSantis administration over that decision. So there has been one redistricting lawsuit that has been filed already, and it was not over the maps, it was over whether or not Governor DeSantis had the constitutional authority to move the federal filing deadline or to authorize the Secretary of State to move the deadline and to call 2026 a redistricting year. So we will see. We're not privy to that lawsuit, but we'll see. We may, file an amicus or something. The lawsuit was, I believe, just filed yesterday or today. It's very new. So we'll see kind of where that goes. But that is a lawsuit that's been filed at the state Supreme Court. It's not a federal lawsuit, it's a state lawsuit. And then the primary election in Florida is August 18th. The November election is November 3rd. So I believe that's the last. Yes. So I'm going to stop my share and everybody can see each other. And I'd love to have any questions, conversation. I know league members, you guys always bring the best, the best questions, best insight.
Well, thanks to Liza, I wanted to say that she has put in a link to the nonpartisan maps.
Oh, good.
And then she's also put in a link to this article about the suing that
Mhm.
the news came out to me yesterday. I don't know if anyone knew about it privately or before. Stacy wants to know what are the legal experts saying about the likely outcome of the Louisiana case with the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so I've been on a lot of calls about kind of what could potentially happen. You know, the the forecasts vary widely. There are folks who believe that, really the Voting Rights Act is on the ropes and that this could be, essentially the nail in the coffin. Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was, in fact, overturned in 2013, and that was the section that required pre-clearance for, counties and states that had a history of racial discrimination in voting. Those states were not allowed to make changes to their election laws unless those laws had been pre-cleared by the federal government. That was wiped out in 2013. And so now states can literally, pass a discriminatory law. It goes into effect right away. People have to sue. It might ultimately get overturned, but, there's no protection for the voter in the form of pre-clearance anymore. So people were saying, Section 2, the redistricting provisions, is one of the last kind of enforceable provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Um, if that is ultimately completely overturned, that would really represent, a massive like undercutting, frankly, of the Voting Rights Act. We might still have the Voting Rights Act, you know, on paper, but that if there's no way to enforce, to practically enforce the requirements, then it's an empty provision. So there are people who really are quite concerned. I'm quite concerned. There are also folks who think, okay, the Roberts Court is probably not gonna be willing to overturn it completely. They may have a more surgical kind of undercutting here and there, but still keep, you know, some of the protections. So we just don't know. Um, and it truly is like speculation to try to guess like what the court is going to do. I think, I think that, the governor trying to use this court case as like rationale for doing a mid-cycle redistricting here in Florida, um, to my mind, the fact that there is no opinion, there's no ruling, right? Like you really, it's making it very obvious that they're just grasping at reasons to do this. When, there's no active court order that requires us to redraw our maps. Even if Louisiana v. Calais comes in, that will only impinge on Louisiana. It will not require us to redraw our maps. And so even that is still, like grasping at straws. It's a red herring. Um, but I'm not going to lie. I mean, I think it would be very damaging for our country and for our democracy if, Louisiana is allowed to enact districts that they know, undermine minority access um, representation. So um, I think that would be a really bad outcome for the country. And I think, really like states, particularly southern states like Florida, will take that as permission to do the same.
Okay. We have a question. Is the Florida Supreme Court pro DeSantis? And someone else has commented that the governor has appointed six of the seven members of the current Florida Supreme Court.
I mean, I don't want to I don't want to cast aspersions on appointees,
Mhm.
but the composition of the court is different than it was when the league challenged the maps in 2012, 13, 14, 15, like that case in 2015. And I was on a panel with Judge Perry, James Perry, who was on the state Supreme Court at the time that the state Supreme Court ruled on the redistricting in 2015. So, like, he is someone who is very familiar with fair districts. He, was on the court when they looked at looked at the fair district standards and the legislature's implementation of those standards or adherence to those standards back then. He expressed, in an open forum, it was actually a league event. LWV of Orange County hosted a lunch and learn. He expressed, real despair that the standards very clearly say that you can't undermine minority representation and that the state Supreme Court allowed the governor's map to go into effect in 2025, right? That was a clear undermining of minority representation and that, you know, he was like, that to me feels like this court will allow anything. But we have to make the best arguments that we can, and fortunately we have very good lawyers. The league has a history of being able to attract and work with really wonderful pro bono legal representation. So I have every confidence that they'll do everything within a legal framework to make a good argument, and I hope that our state Supreme Court will be able to see very clearly the evidence that we say you can't do partisan gerrymandering here in Florida, and all evidence points to this entire effort being undertaken only for partisan reasons.
Any other questions? Anyone?
I don't want to leave people feeling depressed. So I feel like we have a little bit of like a pall over the room. And I really do believe that we have a good opportunity to prevent this from actually going into effect. So, first of all, the governor has been really pushing this. There is a little bit of a schism between the governor and the legislature right now, especially between the governor and the Speaker of the House. And so just because this is a priority of the governor does not mean that the legislature is fully bought into this. Um, if we're able to demonstrate to the legislature that people in Florida do not like this, that even if you are a conservative yourself, you don't want to see the system being rigged, right? Like this idea that this is political gamesmanship, that this is rigging the system, that this is trying to determine the outcome before voters have even had a chance to vote. I mean, those are messages that the vast majority of Floridians, regardless of their political affiliation, like agree with. They do not want to see gamesmanship when it comes to our maps, and that's why they put the Fair Districts amendments into the Constitution in the first place. I did have a meeting with a Republican member of the House who's on the select committee, and he was on the redistricting. He was part of the legislature when they did redistricting in 2022. So he's, very familiar with the standards and understands about how to do redistricting. Um, he, I asked him if he was hearing from his voters on this. He kind of gave me a little like, Yeah, I'm hearing from voters. And I said, "Oh, well, what are they saying? What are you hearing?" And he said, "Well, I'm getting a lot of calls. I would say they're 99 to 1." And I said, 99 to 1. And he said, "Opposed." And I said, "Oh, okay. So Floridians are really like your constituents don't like this." And he said,
Mhm.
"No, no, it's pretty clear that they don't like it."
Mm.
So, so if all members of the legislature are getting that kind of feedback, right? And they are every single member, especially not of the Florida Senate, but of the Florida House, unless they are term limited, they have to run for re-election every 2 years. So they are going to be on the ballot in the fall. And if you're hearing over and over again at a rate of 99 to 1 about something from your district and you are on the ballot, I think you're going to be pretty concerned. So I do feel like we have an opportunity to continue to influence them. There's no guarantees that they'll do the right thing, but we certainly should not consider this a fait accompli. I think we have to keep the heat on. And, as the Ronald Reagan quote, like, if you can't make them see the light, make them feel the heat. And so we've got to keep the heat on, keep the calls coming, keep the letters coming, and educate everyone in our circles about what's going on. I encourage them to call.
So, what is the best way for members to get notices from the League of Women Voters of Florida about redistricting status, action calls, etc.?
Yeah, so we have a member list, a constant contact list, and we, I believe, have everyone if they're you know, in our membership database, you should also be in our constant contact. And so if you're not getting messages, if you're not getting, there's a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks called the Florida Voter. We also send our action alerts. So last week we sent out two action alerts on this. We sent out, well, actually not on this, not on redistricting. We sent out two action alerts on a bad voting rights bill that's moving through the legislature. So if you got those action alerts on 991 and 1334, then you're on our list. If you did not get those action alerts, maybe let Teresa know, and we will try to figure out what's happening that you're not getting our action alerts. But you should be getting our newsletter, our action alerts. We also every once in a while send out like a media advisory and copy our members on that so you can see what we're saying to the press. But we communicate pretty regularly, so you should. As so long as it's not going to spam, you should be hearing from us. Oh, Teresa, you're on mute again.
Sorry, I was trying not to cough a while ago. Uh, Liza's put in a couple of articles about the suit against DeSantis, that if you want to look at that. We have a question. Could the court say that putting a hold on this due to lawsuits is too close to the election and therefore allow it to go forward and deal with lawsuits later?
Yes, they could do that, which is something that we are anxious. So, I mean, we would be and again, I'm not an attorney, but my
Mhm.
suspicion would be that groups that are challenging the map, any map that's done, we would ask for the courts to enjoin the map, basically to stop it from going into effect right away so that it could be litigated. And it would be up to the court to say, yes, we're going to enjoin the map while we go through the process and go to trial, or no, we can't see what immediate harm is done to voters by allowing the map to go into place now, so we'll allow it to go into place and then go to trial. So you know we don't know what the court's ruling would be there.
Okay. And have the supervisor of elections voiced any concern over the timeline to implement new maps?
Yeah, so I think supervisors have been pretty. openly opposing this in that they've said, yeah, this would create a lot of work for us during a time when we already are expecting an increased workload. There have been supervisors who've gone on the record to press saying, yeah, I don't know any supervisors who want this to happen. Right? So there are, pretty open resistance, but not in a way where, I mean, I think ultimately supervisors recognize that they don't want to be at odds with the governor or with the legislature. So, they have to maintain a certain amount of kind of being discreet, I would say. Yeah. And that goes to, there's a really horrible bill moving through the legislature right now that people, the supervisors are not openly supporting, but they're also not openly opposing because I think in general they try to just maintain a low profile and do work behind the scenes to try to get the legislature to, or the Secretary of State to like avoid enacting policy that's going to make it much harder for them, much harder for them as elections administrators. But I don't think they want to be in like an open, warfare situation
Mhm.
because I think they rightly understand that that would make it a lot harder for them to do their jobs.
Right, right. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it. And Jessica is going to send me her slide deck, and then we will be sure to get it out to everyone who registered. And we will be getting this on the web in not too long of time. We're still learning about editing and doing some of those things. So it takes us a little bit longer than maybe than we would have originally liked, but we will be letting everybody know about that.
Well,
So
the other
thank
thing
you.
is,
Go
I would
ahead.
say if anyone on this call is part of the Speakers Bureau, this deck is available for you all to give as presentations,
Oh,
to other groups in your communities. If you have, Rotary clubs, Kiwanis clubs, PTOs, libraries, so, any organizations that you all are part of that have an educational component. We really want this information to be out there to the broader community.